Hi everyone, I'm Patrick Foley and I'm here with Becky Long-Bailey to talk about the Queen's speech. So thanks for joining us, Becky.
It's a pleasure.
So yesterday we saw Prince Charles set out the government's annual plans at the state opening of Parliament. From increasing attacks on our right to protest to continued inaction on the cost of living crisis, this was a Queen's speech that truly missed the mark. And we're on course for the biggest fall in living standards in generations, yet we didn't hear anything about the cost of living crisis in the speech. So what are your fears if this crisis continues to go unaddressed?
Well, look, there were 38 bills in the Queen's speech yesterday, but nothing at all to address the growing and brutal cost of living crisis. And that's absolutely staggering. We've got millions of people skipping meals every day. They're rationing electricity and gas. Inflation's dwarfing many people's wages and benefits payments. And there's a catastrophe coming down the tracks like a speeding train. It's going to be so bad that we know many people might be at risk of losing their homes. They'll be taking on crippling amounts of debt to make ends meet, and their physical and mental health will suffer. But the government yesterday thought that the main priority was a raft of bills that will potentially undermine democracy, workers' rights, safety and environmental standards. So all of our parliamentary time are going to be focused on these ideological bills, like, for example, forcing through the privatisation of Channel 4, which doesn't need to be privatised, or the British Bill of Rights, which is understood to be a backdoor vehicle to undermining the Human Rights Act. Now, in terms of what the government should have been doing, they needed to be setting out an emergency budget at the very, very least. And many of the things that they need to address in that are, for example, increasing universal credit and legacy benefits and pension in line with inflation. Minimum wage needs to be increased to a real living wage with a pathway towards £15 an hour, with businesses who are struggling to be supported to receive government support to be able to do this, and a real terms public sector pay increase. And then lastly, one of the minimum things that the government should have been looking at yesterday was a windfall tax on fossil fuel companies, extending the warm homes discount, home insulation programmes to make sure that people weren't using as much energy. And beyond that, they needed to look at fundamentally reforming our energy system. What they did announce was an energy security bill, which is a bit of a joke, to be honest, because what most people won't realise is that the government shut down our major gas storage site in 2017 without replacing it with anything. They came forward with a load of guff about a green industrial revolution, stole Labour's title, but not the policies, unfortunately. So there's a whole range of policies that need to be rolled out as quickly as possible, really, in terms of that green industrial revolution, which would bring people's bills down.
Yeah, we've heard, I think I'll even quote you on this, we've heard them wax lyrical on quite a lot of things in terms of the environment and energy bills. And what we're seeing continually now is the mention of the Tories' levelling up agenda, which is, it's quite a hard thing to take after they've been in power for 12 years and have implemented 12 years of crippling austerity that has brought us to a lot of these positions anyway. So how can we best expose this levelling up agenda for what it actually is?
Well, there's no levelling up agenda. I mean, there's going to be a levelling up bill, but we still don't know what's going to be in it. And you're right, I mean, they've been in power for over 10 years now, and many of our regions and nations that have felt left behind for so many years haven't received the investment that they deserve. And all they were offered really was a bit of a lottery to try and access the so-called levelling up fund, where the government had the ability to pick winners. And that's not an industrial strategy. An industrial strategy is focusing government and private investment into areas that need it to create jobs and better living standards for everybody, and that hasn't happened. So what we need to see, well, firstly, is a real levelling up agenda, and then beyond that, at the very least, we've got to see the short-term support measures put in place to help people through the crippling cost of living crisis. But beyond that, looking at the causes of the cost of living crisis in the first place, because although there are a lot of international events which have affected our energy prices, for example, they aren't the sole cause of the energy cost crisis. A lot of this can stem right through to the state of the energy system overall, and the fact that over 40 years of privatisation has meant that many of our energy companies have been prioritising dividend extraction over investment in critical infrastructure, and also creating a buffer to help consumers when prices fluctuate like they have done internationally now. And that hasn't happened. And ultimately, I would like to see a discussion about public ownership of our energy system to be brought forward, because I think that's the only real solution to this. Because if we had publicly owned energy companies, we would have been able to use the good times to create a contingency fund, a buffer, if you like, to help people when there were these international price fluctuations. We'd have also had the capacity and the power to roll out a real green industrial revolution. And they were Labour's plans in the last manifesto. By now, we'd have been well on with a street-by-street retrofit programme. We'd have been looking at new clean green heating technologies and made sure that people could afford to have them within their homes. The government isn't doing any of this, so they're waxing lyrical about green policies, but we're not really seeing any substance at all. And in the meantime, people are really suffering.
Yes, and as people suffer, that they rightly want to protest, they want to express their anger and their suffering as well on the streets, and so we've seen the Tories bring about, as you mentioned earlier, or propose this new British Bill of Rights and also the new Public Order Bill.
Yeah.
So it seems that the Tories are cementing their attacks on the right to protest. What can we do? What can our movement do to sort of fight back and to protect these rights and to keep on the streets?
Well, we need to come together as a movement, because what's coming down the track is very, very worrying. We know that people are going to suffer like never before. Inflation is expected to reach at least 10%, according to the Bank of England, yet benefits and pensions only increased by 3.1% this year. So most people are facing a benefits and pensions cut. We know that many people's wages haven't increased. So the cost of living is going to start to bite people who aren't ordinarily classed as being financially vulnerable. It's going to hit people who were previously okay. You know, they were getting by, they were just about managing, if you like. And they're going to be very angry, and their ability to protest will be limited. We've already seen the measures that the government tried to put through in the last parliament, where what's called a serious annoyance, or causing a serious annoyance in a protest, could give you 10 years in prison. That's absolutely staggering, because I'm pretty sure most protests cause a serious annoyance to someone. But what's coming down the tracks is even more Orwellian, for want of a better word. And of course, you've got the Brexit Freedom Bill, which we haven't seen any detail on yet, but many people will fear that this is going to be a bumper selection box of backdoor attempts to cut regulation and water down workers' rights, so that our ability to organise is restricted even more. Now, the government website has very little information on what this Brexit Freedoms Bill is going to be, but it does say that the bill will make it easier to amend or remove outdated retained EU law, and these reforms will cut 1 billion of red tape for UK businesses and ease regulatory burdens. Now, I think we can all read between the lines on that. So whilst the government aren't explicitly saying, yep, we're going to water down workers' rights, environmental standards, health and safety, that's the red tape they're talking about, and we should all be very worried about that.
It's almost the theme of this year's Queen's speech is deregulation, which is quite a shock, considering we just had the P&O scandal in the last few weeks. So any final thoughts on the Queen's speech? What messages we need to send Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak going forward?
I think as a movement, we need to be campaigning for an emergency budget. The government has offered very little. I think one of the only things they've offered is a £200 loan for people on their energy bills. So they're asking people who can't afford to pay their energy bills to take out a loan that they've got to pay back, which is just absolutely absurd. So at the very least, we need that emergency budget. But beyond that, we've got to keep the conversation going on the economic origins of this cost of living crisis, because it hasn't happened by accident. And we actually have the policy ideas within our movement to address this crisis and make sure that it doesn't happen again. So we've got to be bold, and we've got to offer those long-term solutions as well.
Thank you very much, Becky. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.